Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I'm Paul Church. This is our people, culture and tech community. I'm a managing director of Interquest. We're a tech data and digital recruitment business. And we set this community up last July. And the idea being really just to share ideas and experiences to try and make our businesses a little bit better and tackling certain topics and challenges which we all face in our companies and being a part of these companies as well. Today, we're going to be talking about bullying in the workplace and how we can try and identify it, how we can try and handle it, how we can try and hopefully get rid of it as well. It's a very, very sensitive topic. And I think sometimes businesses are a bit concerned to address it for fear of accepting there may be a problem. But I think it is something that needs to be spoken about. And I've enlisted the expertise of our two speakers today to help us along the way. So, Nikki and Jess, welcome to the podcast. Nikki, if we could start with yourself. First of all, how are you? And yeah, how's things going?
I'm very well, thank you, Paul. Very busy at the moment. A lot going on, a lot more inquiries coming through from individuals and businesses at the moment. So yeah, all good.
Thank you. Well, thanks so much for being with us today. And Jess, how are you?
Yes, no, I'm very well, thank you, Paul. Yes, the easing restrictions with lockdown is making life feel a little bit more positive, which is good. And yeah, no, thank you for having me on today. It's, as you said, it's an important topic, both from an employee and employer perspective. So it'll be a good discussion. I agree.
Fantastic. Well, look, thanks also for joining us. So if we could, I suppose, just start with the same kind of questions to you both, just a bit about your background, your journey to this kind of being such a key topic in your day-to-day work, and just why it's such an important issue for you. So Nikki, if I could start with yourself on that, if that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely. The very reason that many people get into this work, that I actually went through this experience myself and suffered quite badly as a result. And I think it took me a lot longer to recover from that than I actually anticipated. But actually, once I did, and I started kind of looking into the subject a little bit more, now that I'm able to stand back and be more objective about it, it's an actually incredibly fascinating subject, and it does really influence a huge amount. When we talk about the behaviours, it influences so much in the workplace, and yet it is so, people find it so difficult to speak about. But I think that is starting to change, and not before time. So, but yes, certainly it was my own journey that led me on this path to setting up the business conduct change.
Fantastic. Tell us a bit about conduct change.
Well, we have three parts to the business. So the first part is very much about working with businesses in terms of training, bullying awareness, emotional intelligence, psychological safety, cyber safety, all of those different areas that actually influence through, but also helping them to change the culture. Because unless we change the behaviours and the culture, then all the processes and systems in the world aren't going to make a difference. We also then use that work to subsidise some moving on programmes for supporting individuals who have been through bullying in the workplace and are struggling emotionally and financially to move on. So we keep them very, very low cost to help people at that point in time. And then we also have a campaigning arm, which is really looking at influencing change in this area, including legislation, which I think segues very neatly to Jess.
Absolutely. And absolutely, we'd absolutely like to talk about the legislation you're both campaigning for. So we'll come to that in just one sec. But Jess, if you could just talk a bit about your journey into the position you're in and why this topic's so important to you, then we'll get on to that. That'd be great.
Yeah, no, of course. Yes. So, I mean, I'm a solicitor. I've been in practice for 11 years this year, doing a wide range of employment-related support for people, and sort of developed a bit of a niche in what we umbrella terms of stress at work claims, so which covers a wide spectrum of issues really, but a significant proportion of people coming to us to see if they've got any legal help or recourse are people who've been through bullying issues at work. An incredibly high amount of those, and that as a practitioner is quite shocking. And it's often not just the bullying itself, it's about how it's been handled or not handled, as the case may be. And, you know, the more we've worked in this area, you know, we've got a team at Oakwood Solicitors that just specialise in these sorts of issues. And we really, you know, it's a claim at the end of the day, but what we're hoping to achieve is that companies are being educated and understanding, you know, that these are important issues to address. Early intervention is key. Changing the culture so people feel as though they can speak up is key. You know, people shouldn't be having to go to court to get their voices heard. It should be dealt with much earlier on. So from a sort of practice point of view, dealing with, you know, lots of different clients, it's become a bit of a passion. That's how I've met Nikki through our working together and looking at raising awareness of what law is available to support people. And what law isn't there, and should there be something there to help people better than it currently is.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for the intro, Jess. And just to the audience now, just before I crack on with my line of questioning, as it were, if anybody does have any questions, please, as always, feel free to pop your hand up and let me know. And I can invite you in. If it is a sensitive topic, so if you'd like to put a message to the private chat to me, I'm happy to ask it on your behalf, so that's fine as well. And if it's just a case of anyone wants to share any experiences, please do so as well. So moving on then, so let's talk about the legislative campaign that you're both on, and how it kind of where it came from and where you're at. If you could, I suppose, Jess, if we go back to you, if you wouldn't mind starting with that'd be great.
Yeah, so currently, if you're bullied at work, you know, how can the law help? Or you know, that was our starting point. And unless you've been bullied with an underlying motive, which may be discriminatory, so because you're male, because of your age, your religion, that sort of thing, there is a bit of a black hole in terms of legal support, where if you're just bullied, you know, in general terms, as most people will understand bullying to mean, unless you've sort of complained and that's been mishandled in some way, and you've suffered some sort of really serious mental health problem, there isn't really anywhere to go. There is no, you know, legal protection as such. Part of that is there is no one legal definition of bullying. And I think if you were to ask lots of different people, what do you think is bullying? What would you define as bullying? You'd get a huge spectrum of different responses. And I think, you know, the law also struggles with that. You know, what do they think bullying should be? And I think that's in part why there isn't a definition. But in that creates a lot of confusion. Employers have no idea what they should or shouldn't be doing. Employees don't understand if they've got any legal protection or not. And I think in that confusion creates a lot of unnecessary sort of fallout, upset, damage to people's mental health along the way. So the campaign that I'm supporting Nikki with is looking at filling that gap and drawing everybody's attention to the fact there is this gap, with a view to, you know, protect employers so they know what they're doing, and also protect employees.
Gotcha. Nikki, have you got anything to add to that at all?
I think just from my point of view, having been through it myself, I think one of the things that I discovered when I met Jess was that I only had half the story about what support was out there for me. I thought my only option was an employment tribunal. I didn't know that there were other routes that I could go through to seek the redress that I was looking for at the time. I actually didn't go to court in the end. I was too ill to go that far, but it really kind of brought it home to me that there's a huge amount about the legislation that we don't know about that could be used in these areas, and really wanted to highlight that. And then obviously having worked with Jess and understanding that there were more gaps, then we now have the legislation working group with a couple of other legal professionals on there as well, who are really helping us address these issues. And so, yes, it's really exciting for me to hear all those conversations going on and actually see some progress in those areas. So hopefully we will have something to share. I'm going to say later this year, and I'm sure Jess will tell me if that's too soon, because I do get very excited.
It's crazy to think that, you know, such a serious problem, which, and then almost, you know, a common one which doesn't have a legal definition, and it's crazy to think you need to campaign for it. But it's great you both are. Is there? Do you think it's worth at this stage kind of just breaking down what that definition of bullying should mean and what it should be for the benefit of the audience?
I think it is something that we are still exploring, if I'm honest. And when you're looking at the legal definition, the one that ACAS uses is actually very closely linked to a case that went through the courts some time ago now. And so in some ways, it makes sense to stick with that. But I think one of the key issues around trying to define bullying is that it is such a broad spectrum of behaviours. And I guess the key issue there is actually about what we need to do is we need to raise understanding from employers, from people who are bringing bullying complaints about what bullying actually is, so that we've got those going hand in hand. And I'll let Jess pick up a little bit on the definition there.
Yeah, I mean, it is difficult because it's subjective. You know, bullying could be something quite obvious, you know, a really sort of unkind remark, which is clearly meant to upset somebody, or it could be something that over a period of time, you know, something which sounds quite trivial, you know, being ignored every day. Somebody goes in the office and says hello to every single person other than you every single day. That's going to have a build-up sort of a cumulative effect. So what we're looking at is trying to pin down, looking at more how is it received by the person, you know, and an awareness of, well, does it have the potential to upset somebody, and is that the motivation behind it? You know, is the behaviour directly aimed at them rather than just sort of, you know, sometimes people are quite, you know, casual in their comments to a wider group. You know, that's probably not going to fit into what we need it to. You know, and I think the word oppressive has been used as quite a key word as well. You know, that sort of has to be something that isn't intentionally or unintentionally there to create an oppressive environment or response to somebody. But as Nikki says, we've not cracked it. We've shared lots of ideas about what we think it should be, but we want to be very careful to make sure it covers everything it needs to, and to cover as many people's situations as it can as well.
Gotcha, makes sense. Thanks, Jess. And then moving away from the legal definition side, if we're talking about the reality of what you both come across and what you hear about, what you see, what are some of the most common various types of bullying that you're kind of being notified of?
I think certainly there's a lot more psychological bullying these days, and you hear the word gaslighting being used a lot, where people start to very much doubt themselves and, did I say that? Did they say that? Did I do that? Did they do that? Absolutely being put into that situation. But really that constantly being undermined or humiliated in front of others are very, very common complaints that we hear now as well. So I think a lot of it is much more covert these days. It's not necessarily obvious to other people around them. And I think that's a really important point because it's very much, bullying is very much a unique relationship between two people. I mean, it can be groups, but when we're looking at just two people, it is a unique relationship, and it will be perceived by those people in a very different way to the way that observers might view it. And I think that's really, really important to understand as well. But certainly in terms of the range of behaviours, it's such a huge spectrum from, as Jess mentioned, the rudeness, the incivilities, the what are termed microaggressions now. So the rolling the eyes, the raising the eyebrows, the glancing across the table, the smirking. It can also be so physical behaviours, so anything from violence right down to literally just turning away from somebody, not letting them into your space. Verbal abuse can be from shouting, but it can be whispering about people, but it can also be not talking to them. And then the psychological, where we've talked a little bit more about that there. And those are kind of like your personal behaviours. But you also need to look at work-related bullying behaviours, and they very much align with the standards put out by the Health and Safety Executive, which are the same ones used in stress risk assessments. So about the control you've got over the work, the demands and the workload is excessive on one person in the team. Just the whether you've got good support, good relationships, whether there's clarity about the role, or whether there's change happening in the whole organisation that is, you know, actually not treating one group of people fairly, for example. So that was quite a large range that I just covered there. Did I leave you anything, Jess?
It is. It's just sorry, just before Jess asks, it is a really large range. All of them made sense. All of them ring true. But it always really does hit home how varied and how broad it can be, and how it can be. These things can be bullying. Jess, what did you have to add to that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is sometimes industry specific as well. You know, whether you're working in a factory environment, there might be different types of behaviours there, you know, compared to maybe a more professional office environment, which these things happen just as much there as well. And I wonder if now is a good time to sort of mention the word banter.
Yeah.
This is a huge, you know, I certainly come across this, you know, when we're helping people raise complaints against their employer or former employer, you know, you get a response saying, oh, well, it was just banter, you know, but that I think that word is something which needs to, you know, go in the bin. It's quite an old-fashioned term used to refer to what I think, if we looked at it now, would not be, you know, excusable behaviour. And I think a lot of managers turn a blind eye to sort of those sorts of behaviours because they think, oh, well, it's just a laugh, it's just a joke, you know, and, you know, we can all take a laugh and a joke, and, you know, you've got to know your audience and all the rest of it. But it's where, you know, I think that's where managers need perhaps, you know, training or education in some way to sort of identify, well, what's stepping over that line. And that's hard, you know, that's a hard assessment to make. But really they should be sort of, you know, swaying towards being more cautious, just to be on the safe side. But yeah, it is so varied. And, you know, in practice, you know, my job is incredibly interesting because every case is different. So, you know, we do get things from, you know, threats to assault somebody, to actual assaults and physical altercations, as Nikki mentioned. But a lot of it is more subtle, sort of grinding somebody down, you know, day to day, you know, unreasonable pressures that isn't applied across the board. You know, and when people have spoken up or tried to speak up, you know, if they've not been listened to, it just makes them retreat and think, well, there's no point, you know, if I say something, I'm just not going to get the help. And then that continues to go on. So that is more common, and that's a more common situation than I see, rather than something that may be more obvious, or certainly from a physical point of view.
The word banter, I mean, we talked about it the other day. I mean, I can't stand that word anyway, but I think that banter it very much undermines the impact of cruel behaviour could have on somebody. It's just saying that is another, you know, you could say it's another form of bullying by saying, oh, it's just banter, you know, get over it, whatever. It's not, it's a very unhealthy word. Nikki, do you have anything to add? I did have banter on my list. So do you have anything you want to add about banter and the use of that word at all?
I think, you know, the key thing to remember about banter is that it's only if you're able to enter into it willingly and on an equal level. And actually, if you're laughing along with something because you think, if I don't laugh, I'm probably going to lose my job or I'll get excluded from the group, then that's not banter. That's not on an equal level. And we're not saying take the humour out of the workplace. We're saying recognise that you have the right to say, no, I don't find that funny. And actually speak up for yourself and ask for that behaviour, that language, that joking to stop.
Yeah, that makes sense. We've got a couple of questions that come through to the direct chat, so I'm gonna go straight into those if that's all right. So the first one, and Nikki, I'll go straight to you first of all on this one, is what behaviours might exemplify the opposite to those of bullying?
So really, really key are the people who are actively listening and engaging and being present with people, showing empathy, a willingness to kind of step away from their view and look at the perspective from the other person, and that they're being fair in terms of workload, in terms of working hours, in terms of training, ensuring they've got the equipment they need, that everything they need, and that they're supportive. And as a coach, I would say adopt a coaching approach to help people find solutions, making sure that there is some flexibility in the workplace. A lot of these behaviours are actually developed through emotional intelligence, developing your emotional intelligence skills. And it's just that being respectful. And I think the most important thing that starts from that is actually the inclusion and the acceptance that we are all different. And actually it's our differences that make us work collectively as a much stronger team by bringing divergent thinking. And actually, if you have a team that you're working in where all of these things happen and you have that psychological safety, that means when you speak up, you are not at risk of being humiliated or retaliation or losing your status or your position or anything like that, then that is absolutely ultimate. That's how the highest performing teams function. And it's those behaviours that underpin that, in terms of that acceptance, that empathy, all of those aspects are so important to enable people to feel safe in the workplace.
Absolutely. Jess, do you have anything to add to that at all?
No, I think I mean, yeah, I mean, Nikki's she's a professional in that area in helping companies develop better culture and those sorts of things. So yeah, I mean, it's that, you know, communication is key. It's an oldie but a goodie, you know, that is it. If people feel listened to, they understand the situation, there's an open and transparent working environment, all of those, you know, they seem like the basics and they seem so, you know, obvious. But, you know, if companies can take a step back and think, well, have we, you know, ticked all the boxes with these basics? You know, I think that makes a huge difference.
Perfect. Thanks, Jess. Go on, Nikki. Did you have something to add?
I was just going to add something. Yeah, I think it's really about understanding the emotional responses that people have as well. And if you understand yourself and your own emotional responses and the impact that you might have on others, then you are able to anticipate much more how people might respond to a difficult conversation, for example, and start to adjust to make sure that it's received in the right way. But actually, particularly when people are working under stress or under high pressure, then recognizing that behavior can change and stopping to say, I've noticed a change in you. What do you need? What support do you need at this stage is so important. And that's where knowing your team comes in.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely agree. And then, Nikki, if I stay with you just for this next question, is how would or should an employee deal with bullying from their superiors rather than people at the same level as them in businesses where there's, and perhaps if we imagine a business where there's no real HR function, and actually where the owner or the founder might be the most senior person. So what if the owner is the bully, but there's no HR and the employee doesn't want to lose their job? What do they do?
Yeah, that's a really tough position to be in. And I think, you know, the key thing is, does that person have someone working alongside them that you trust, that you could go and talk to? Is there a board that sits within that organisation that helps as well? And perhaps you could go to a board member. It's really difficult when you haven't got an HR function. But then again, sometimes it's very difficult when you have got one. So but when it's the owner or founder of an organisation, then that really is the most difficult situation. So I think that's all right. Yeah. And I think this one comes up again and again and again for me. And more often than not, the person in that role ends up walking away basically because it's the safest thing for them to do for their own health and well-being. So apologies, the postman just arrived as well. So if you've got the dog in the background then. So yeah, it is a really, really tough position, and it's one of the areas that we're trying to look at in terms of the legislation as well. And I'm guessing, Jess, you probably get quite a few people coming in this situation.
Yes, yeah, too common really. It's you know, the way in which the law is set out is the burden is really on the employee to complain and raise it, you know, wave the red flag, this is an issue, you know, my health's suffering, I need some support. It's very difficult to do in reality. It's quite a naive approach, I think, for the legal framework to have, is to expect that people can just do that quite easily. Even if they do have a really great HR, you know, support system. But yeah, we have clients coming to say, well, you know, it's a one-man band, you know, and it's the owner and it's them that's the problem. And it's very disheartening to say, well, you know, look, you could write a letter of complaint, you know, you could try and talk to them, but you know that environment better than anybody. You know, I don't know that them. I don't know how they're in politics and working. And if you really think that ultimately you're not going to get anywhere with doing that, it's not going to change, it is the way it is, then the only option is to safeguard your own health, you know, your own health and safety. You've got a duty of care to keep yourself safe. And sadly, it usually is that the employee has to look for something else and move on. That doesn't tackle the problem because someone else will come in and they'll probably be targeted in the same way. And unfortunately, at the moment, the way in which sort of things stand, certainly from a legislative point of view, is that's just the way the system works. You know, nobody regulates who can set up a company. You know, you can set up a company and hire people with no training on these sorts of things. You know, and I know there's a lot of campaigning for, you know, the health and safety executive to sort of, they are, you know, they do a lot with mental health at work and stress risk assessment advice, but it's not as mandatory as physical health and safety is. So I think that's got a way to go. But yeah, I mean, practical steps is sort of just keeping a record, keeping a diary, try and confide in somebody. And ultimately, if you think your health's suffering, is speak to a medical professional. Nothing is worth your health suffering. You know, it's not just the short-term implication, it's, you know, the longer-term effect as well. So you've got to put yourself first from that point of view.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, Nikki, go on.
I was just going to say, and I know that from, you know, experience, that is a really, really hard thing to hear, to say, well, you should walk away from your job when it can be a job that you really love doing and that you need as well. So it's a really, really tough thing to hear. But yeah, absolutely, your health has to come first. And I think the thing is that now people are starting to speak up more about their experiences, and that will damage the reputation of these companies. And you've got also, you know, websites like Glassdoor where people are being very honest about the experiences they've had, and companies do need to start recognizing that people will talk about them and people won't want to work there in the end. But yeah, it's a really, really tough position to be in.
We've got some more comments coming through on the direct chat. So this is the comment rather than a question, but it's in answer to the previous question. If your manager is the source of the bullying and he or she is the golden child favoured by the executive team, you don't have a chance, and walking away might be the only option. Also, companies say, please speak. Companies will on Glassdoor say, please speak to the HR team. We'd love to hear from you. And might even be genuine in that intent, but once the pattern of fear has been established, it's really difficult to overcome. And I think that kind of echoes what you're both saying. I mean, from my point of view, Jess, you kind of took the words out of my mouth in my head anyway, was that it's very difficult. Everyone's got different situations, different responsibilities. But for me, there's not really a job or a paycheck that's worth your mental health, because that will really, really grind you down. And that's, you you can't put a price on that. With that kind of leads me on to just a little bit around the mental health side of things. What's the implications on people's mental health that you both see or hear about? I mean, what kind of situations have you come across? Nikki, if we go to you.
Absolutely a huge spectrum again, but in the worst case scenario, then essentially you've got people whose mental health is damaged so badly that they will never work again. Well, I guess the worst case scenario is actually beyond that. It's suicide, essentially. And many people reach the point of suicidal ideation, even if they don't cross that final boundary. But it's very much shows up as trauma. So we talk about mental, if you catch it very, very early on, if you intervene very early on, then it may have caused some mental health problems, but they may be recoverable from. When it has gone, continues through that process, and it's a layering of trauma, and this is where it escalates. And so essentially every small action creates a small amount of trauma. And then when people are staying in the threat response mode, they're in fight or flight mode because they're constantly looking for the next threat, then their bodies can't cope with that. And so it has a huge impact psychologically and physically on the body. But particularly once you get into formal processes and you're constantly having to repeat the story, repeat the events, go through it again and again. And I noticed that actually somebody's put a comment there about keeping the record makes them feel worse. And actually it's one of those things where I didn't keep records because I wasn't aware it was happening to me, and I was in denial for quite a long time, which meant I then had to go back through and revisit all of those different events and try and find the evidence that I needed. So every time I did that, it was reinforcing the trauma in my body. I then went through an investigation. No, I had the initial conversation, the informal conversation, as they call it. Then I had to go through an investigation. Then I went through an appeal and a second appeal. And then I've talked to a solicitor about it. And actually all that did was layer the trauma. And what that meant was that finally I just completely burnt out at the end of it all. I was not capable of going to tribunal. I wasn't capable of working again for a long, long time. And I don't think people realise how much that does impact, but it's that drip, drip, drip that has that, as Jess said earlier, the cumulative effect that really knocks you, it takes you out of being yourself, I think is the best way I can describe it.
And this is every day, you know, it's 5 days a week. Talk about drip, drip, drip. It's not just like once in a while. It's going to grind and grind and grind you down, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's when you're at home as well, so you don't cut off from it, and particularly with cyberbullying and things like that now. But you're trawling through emails as well, looking for evidence. So you never stop. But one of the key things about workplace bullying trauma is that you constantly ruminate. You're going through events again and again in your head, or you're talking to people around you again and again. And your brain cannot distinguish between whether that is actually happening or whether you are just thinking about it at the time, and your body has the same physiological response. And so that absolutely, it just breaks your body down and your mind down over a period of time. So it can be really, really, it can be substantial, the damage that can be done.
I've got a question. I'll go to you, Jess. I've got a question which kind of follows on from that a bit, but it's come from the direct chat. So, question for Jess: what is the best way to track workplace bullying when you've reached out to other people, those who are bullying, and the issue isn't resolved? As a lawyer, what do you ask for when people need to prove they are being bullied?
Very difficult because quite a lot of this behaviour is one-on-one, so it's behind closed doors and it's difficult. I mean, I always start from a point of, if a client's coming to me, I accept what they say at face value, and then I have to say, well, look, the court's going to need something else. They're going to need just something else to reinforce what you're saying. So from a practical point of view, what we're saying to clients is there somebody else who's maybe seen them behave this way, or have they been subject to bullying? What you find is people who still work in that environment obviously don't want to stick their head above the parapet, but if they've moved on and they've left because of a similar issue, then they're more inclined to help. But, you know, ultimately in the day, if it's one word against another, that doesn't mean you can't prove your case. You know, if you come across really well, and, you know, ultimately, I mean, most cases settle out of court, mainly from a reputational point of view. Companies don't want them going to court. But if it did, the judge would essentially weigh up how credible you are. Do you know, does what you say make more sense than what the other side are saying? And so having sort of witness evidence is very difficult, but that's where keeping a log of events is helpful, whether that's just a little scribble in an actual diary, or if it's something on your phone, a calendar. You know, the court can look at that and say, well, you made that record on that day, so that seems pretty accurate, a reflection of what was going on. But it is a practical difficulty is proving these things. But as I say, I always start from a point of, well, you know, people wouldn't choose to lie about what they've been through. You know, this has happened. So how do we navigate through the legal framework to try and get them some sense of, you know, justice and closure on the situation?
I've just got one more question I'm going to go to from the chat before we get on to the, I suppose, solutions and practical advice, what businesses can do. But it kind of follows on from what you're saying there, Jess. So many a time it depends on how a person perceives things. So a reaction of two people to discriminatory actions may be different. What if just one person complains about it, the other one's okay with it, and the manager or supervisor shuts down the person complaining, giving the example of the other one? What does one do in such a case? I mean, I'm thinking of that word banter now, because I'm thinking that someone could use that. But what do you both think? That's
a difficult one again, because it is subjective, isn't it? And, you know, sometimes you do feel, you know, some sympathy for the person who's accused of bullying, if what they've said in context, you know, maybe just hasn't gone down well with one person, but a wider group, no one else has raised an issue. I think that's fine. You know, we're all human. We all say things, or, you know, might not mean them to come out sometimes the way they do. So I think then it's looking at, well, how is that situation handled? You know, the comments been and gone. Somebody's now upset about it, and they want to be heard and listened to and not be dismissed. You know, they want to be treated seriously with what they've got to say. So I think it's that needs to be handled properly. And I think if there's a you know, a good HR function or line management you know, support system that can deal with that in an informal way, nip the issue in the bud, and these things don't escalate. You know, just jumping back a little bit about sort of the mental health impact, you know, I see clients when they're beyond the point of, you know, any turning back, really. I see them at this sort of the last resort. You know, they're not wanting to come and speak to a solicitor about these things. They hoped it would get sorted without that being involved. You know, so we see people very serious mental health conditions. Their marriage may have broken down. They've not got any money because, you know, they're out of work. They might have lost their home. It can quite quickly turn into, you know, a bit of a relationship issue or dispute, you know, to sort of pale it down a bit, to something that can quite quickly go into a serious life event that, as Nikki said, is traumatic and is going to take some time to build back up from. So it's that early intervention and those basic skills of just listening, treating people fairly, and not dismissing people's views.
Absolutely. Nikki, anything to add on that one at all?
I don't think I do at the moment, actually.
Fine. Okay. Cool. No, good. Thank you for the answer, Jess. So let's move on to I suppose what businesses can do. So what can businesses do first of all, Nikki, to identify if bullying is a problem in their workplace? If you're, you know, CEO, you've got no idea what's really going on, perhaps necessarily. Where do they start? What do they do?
So there's some really simple things they can look at in terms of, have they included a question about workplace bullying in their employee survey? Have they looked at the number of complaints going through? What's the absentee rate like? What's the staff turnover rate like? Those kind of metrics are quite easy to look at. But I think, you know, don't wait as a business to identify if there is a workplace bullying problem. actually take some proactive steps to make sure that you prevent the opportunity for workplace bullying. And that's a much more powerful thing to do. When you look at the spectrum of bullying behaviours, then there's not an organisation in the land that can actually say we don't have any bullying behaviours, because actually every single one of us is capable of exhibiting some form of bullying behaviour when you look at that spectrum at any point in time. And it's really whether those behaviours become entrenched and become the norm in that organisation, where that might be the problem. And you've got businesses, I mean, they're all in different places. They're all going to be from a different starting point, aren't they? So you might have a fairly new business that is trying to embed a really good culture from the outset, in which case, you know, make sure that if you have a conversation about mental health, you're talking about workplace bullying. If you're talking about the culture, you're talking about workplace bullying. If you're talking about line management training, you're talking about workplace bullying. If you're talking about diversity and inclusion, you're talking about workplace bullying. It actually underpins, the behaviours underpin and flow through every department, every strategy in the organisation. So that for me is really really key to recognise. And it's really essential that actually as organisations we start looking at behaviours, agreeing behaviours, measuring behaviours, and encouraging people to change and supporting them to change. And one of the really key things for me when we're looking at workplace bullying is you cannot resolve workplace bullying from a place of anger. What you actually need to do is go in, if there is an issue, if you've discovered there is an issue in your organisation, actually put the support in first, help the parties involved to change, but at the same time, be prepared to hold them accountable if they're not prepared to do so. And make sure that is visible and transparent to the workforce. Let them know that you are going to uphold the standards of behaviours that you agree to. But first things first, let's talk about it. Let's have those courageous conversations in the workplace that say, yes, we recognise that bullying is real and we need to do more to prevent it.
Absolutely, so much there. Thanks so much, Nikki. Jess, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think it's you know, it's very difficult on a day-to-day basis. You know, CEOs and those at board level, they're, you know, juggling lots of different priorities, and it's trying to get this on their radar that this is something important to be doing something about. And, you know, with the last 12, 18 months we've sort of had, and, you know, as we come out of lockdown to some sort of normal again, it's a good opportunity, I think, for lots of companies to sort of press the reset button on these other issues and think about, well, what can we be doing differently? And I think as well, it's about what's happening at ground level. You know, managers only get told so much. They're not in the loop with the day-to-day inner workings of the company. So, you know, don't be afraid to set up some sort of committee or sort of support group, even a mentor support group perhaps, where you're actually asking people, look, what's going on? You know, you're not getting into trouble, like, but, you know, what's going on here? We've had a few people leave. Is there a problem? We'd rather know, so then we can tackle it. You know, you can do anonymous surveys, things like that. You know, exit interviews, although I completely agree with Nikki, that's maybe too late, but you can look at, well, look, why are people leaving? Try and get them to be honest. At that point, they're not worried about their job security anymore because they're out the door, so they may be a bit more willing to be open about things. And I think as well is that companies shouldn't worry to the extent, you know, that they have to have a grip on everything. You know, obviously from a practical point of view, the expectation isn't that they know absolutely everything that's going on and that they're doing, you know, that they have no bullying at all. But if they can promote positive work environments and zero tolerance to bullying, then that will filter out. You know, people talk, they will talk to each other. If they've been to HR and said, oh, well, I mentioned this issue about and they didn't bother, then that's going to have a ripple effect and people are just going to keep quiet and it's just never going to change. So yeah, I think those at the top just need to sort of have a look at what's going on at ground level and see what improvements they can perhaps make from there.
Absolutely makes sense. We had another question come through on the private chat, and this is, I suppose, moving away from the business side, but the personal side. And Nikki, if I go to you on this one, so hi Paul, everything that's been discussed, I've been through. 1.5 years later, I want to get back into the workplace, but I'm frightened. I'm scared people will see my vulnerability, and I'll be a target again, or I will fail. Please, could you advise some tips on how you start to recover, get back to normal? I want to get out of this space and be myself again. So Nikki, do you have any advice there at all?
Yeah, when I went through it, I remember going through all sorts of different processes and training and coaching and all sorts of different things. And I think it's really about finding a coach or somebody to talk to who can really understand what you've been through and help you rebuild your confidence. One of the programs we run is called the Moving On from Workplace Bullying program. And it's a group of a maximum of 6. And one of the most powerful things they get from being part of that group is very much the being with a group of people who just get it, where they can just say, this happened to me, and everybody just nods along and doesn't question them. And I think that acceptance that they've experienced something real, unique to everybody in there, is really, really powerful. But actually what we do is we don't focus on the story and the experience. We focus on the finding your way back to yourself, is how I describe it. Because actually what you need to do is you need to rebuild confidence, you need to rebuild trust, you need to start actually recognizing the strengths, the values, the qualities that you still have but may have forgotten about in yourself. And actually you need to be quite gentle with yourself, because it can be quite scary going back into a new organisation. And I have had people who've been back in, and for quite a long time they were very distrustful of people around them, because they thought, why are they accepting me as I am? What's going to happen? So they were still waiting for that next issue to arise. And actually, if you don't get that help, then it's very common for people to go through roles and say, well, I've been bullied in my last 3 jobs. So don't be afraid to reach out for that help, and find someone who really understands it as an issue to work with. So, and we do have a Moving On program starting. I've got a new one starting next week. So if they want to get in touch with me, then very happy to try and help them, get them on the right path again.
What is the best way for someone to get in touch with you, Nikki?
Can email me directly. So nikki@conductchange.co.uk, or just jump onto the website, and we have a contact form on there. So conductchange.co.uk.
Perfect, thanks so much. Jess, was there anything to add to that question, which I just put to Nikki from the chat?
No, I think that covered everything really. I mean, I think it's know that there are good employers out there and organisations that handle these things really, really well. You know, I'm not a medical practitioner, but from experience with clients, you know, I do say to them, you know, there is light at the end of the tunnel, you know, and a lot of people make claims, you know, not because money can change anything, and it often doesn't really compensate for what you've been through anyway, but it maybe gives you answers to unanswered questions, and in that brings some closure. So whatever mode works for you, it's finding some way to draw a nice firm line as best you can under that experience, you know. And, you know, working with Nikki, you know, Nikki is very inspiring. You know, she's turned the negative experience into a huge positive and is now helping people, you know. And if people can find some positive out of it and have the strength to do something, you know, with that awful experience they've been through, then I think they'll find that it makes sense what's happened to them, and it gives them a purpose to go on to something new.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I agree with everything you said there. And I'm just looking at the time, so I'm conscious of where we're at, and we're coming up to the hour. Nikki, is there anything else that you think is important for businesses to kind of think about in terms of the bullying problem, whether it's identifying, whether it's come up, anything that is really, really important you think we should hit home?
I'd like to just touch on cyber bullying, or cyber safety, as I like to refer to it, because I think particularly with the extra remote working that people are doing, we tend to think of cyber bullying as being kind of the attacks on social media. And yes, it can be that, particularly as people are very much blurring the boundaries. They're being asked to use their own personal phones to put apps on, their own equipment at home sometimes. And actually, one of the things that we do is we very much emphasize the fact that if you're looking at cyberbullying, you need to look at cybersecurity as well. So really, cybersecurity and understanding the risks online is very much about how people behave online. And so when you look about workplace cyber safety, then look at actually how are people using their emails, how are they using their social media accounts, even phone calls and text messages. And actually part of that includes the being on 24/7 when people are just sending messages at all times as well. So when we think about cyberbullying, we do think, as I say, about just about social media, but actually it's been going on a lot longer than that in terms of emails and text messages and all that kind of stuff already. But it's growing exponentially with the remote working. And so it's really, really important that people consider, for example, does your social media policy refer to cyberbullying and behaviours? Because actually it should be linked all the way through. Are people really clear about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable? So excluding people from a social media group, for example, is really unacceptable. And it's also, people don't necessarily know that they're being bullied, because it can be happening behind their backs, very much so like that as well. So encouraging people not to be bystanders and to speak up and to share what they've found so that it can't go on anonymously in the background or anything like that, then that's really important.
So much of this is just down to businesses taking responsibility for the training they provide their people, aren't they? Because there are, people may not understand the impact of how words may sound or what may be appropriate or inappropriate in the workplace. So it's up to the employer really to take the initiative and make sure everyone goes through that training, isn't it, really?
Definitely. I think being passive is sometimes just as bad as doing something. So as Nikki said, being a bystander, you're actively allowing something to continue. And, the working from home mentality, a lot of companies will keep some flexibility, I'm sure. And there's lots of positives to that, certainly for people's mental health, but they have less of a control of perhaps what's going on. And they need to think about, what policies do they have, what training have they delivered, and other ways to communicate, because you've lost that, perhaps as much that sense of being together physically in an office. And, we all know the tone of emails or a message, you sometimes read into it, the wrong way, or things come across wrong. And so all of those little things, I think, need to be managed, and there need to be a structure in place, and just for it to be thought through, really, not just assume that it'll be fine all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the final question now, I suppose we both start with you, Nikki, is just, we've given so much advice today, or you both have given so much advice today, I should say. What's the one last thing, I suppose, you just really hit home for if you're an individual who has been impacted by bullying to themselves, and you're struggling in any way, what's one bit of advice you'd suggest?
Self-care has to come first. Always. Your health has to come first. It doesn't mean don't take a complaint forward, but it means take time for yourself to rebuild your strength. Even if that means taking time off work, then absolutely rebuild your strength before you decide to go down that route, and educate yourself so that you know what you could potentially be getting into. at least as things stand at the moment, until we've changed them all with our campaigning.
Absolutely. And Jess, anything to add to that at all?
Yeah, I mean, seek professional help would be mine. You know, it doesn't, not necessarily legal help, but you know, medical help is, as we've said, is your health's the most important factor in all of it. And sometimes when you're in the eye of the storm of it, it's hard to necessarily see that. But that's where I signpost anybody who rings me, if they've not already. That's where I say, look, go and do that. And then if you still want to understand what your legal options are, then come to us. I mean, we offer a free assessment, free chat. You know, we're quite a friendly bunch, not like perhaps as people suspect lawyers to be. But I think working in this area, you do have an empathy. You have to have a passion to help people in it, because they're sometimes quite difficult subject matters to help people with. But, you know, if you just want to know, well, what are my legal options? Do I have any legal options? Often that makes people feel informed as to which direction they can then go in.
Absolutely. And we got Nikki's contact details earlier. Jess, if someone wants to reach out to you, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, if you just search engine, probably my name in Oakwood Solicitors, I'll come up. Yeah, my email address is just j.rowson@oakwoodsolicitors.co.uk. So if anybody has any questions or thinks I can help somebody they know, then we're just at the end of the email, end of the phone if you need us.
Fantastic. Thanks so much to you both. So I know how busy you both are. So Jess and Nikki, thank you so much for spending an hour with us and giving such fantastic advice.
You're welcome. And just to let everybody know that I have read the messages in the chat. So thank you for those messages as well.
Absolutely. Thank you to the audience for attending this week. Next week, we're going to be discussing burnout in the workplace. What are the signs and how can we prevent it? So please do tune in. Apart from that, thanks again to our speakers, and I hope everyone has a top week. See you later on.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.